So much has been happening in the last 10 years that the possibilities seem endless. We're now talking about the possibilities of mining asteroids. We're talking about the possibility of mining the moon, which seems kind of crazy. We're talking about the possibilities of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people eventually being in space with full-time jobs. And so we really wanted to put together an incredible panel, which I think we've done, of people to talk about what their company's involvement is in that and what's happening. So quick introductions. I'm Matt Harbert. I'm the VP of Raise, which is a venture-backed commercial real estate company. We've built technology internally to help clients like aerospace companies grow their real estate, find, build, and manage their real estate across the US. I'm also the host of the Executive Podcast, which interviews entrepreneurs, investors, and operators and get their life lessons and advice on how to make it at the highest level. Joined by an amazing panel. Let's start with Monica Palko. Monica Palko is the Chief Legal and Administrative Officer of York Space, which is designing and manufacturing spacecraft systems. Recently won a $342 million project from the Defense Department to build 42 satellites for their Internet in Space constellation. In addition to her role at York Space, Monica serves on the board of the Association of Corporate Counsel, which is the largest organization serving the professional and business interests of attorneys, about 45,000 members worldwide. Prior to York, Ms. Palko also was the general counsel of Lockheed Martin, and prior to that was a trial defense attorney. And then next to her—
Lockheed Martin Space, by the way.
Not in space?
No, Lockheed Martin Space.
Lockheed Martin Space,
right.
yeah.
Yep, not all of Lockheed.
Not all fancy.
Yeah.
We're also joined by Steve Lindsey. Steve Lindsey is the CTO and SVP of Advanced Programs at Sierra Space, which is a spin-out of Sierra Nevada. They raised a $1.4 billion Series A at a $4.5 billion valuation. Steve is a former Air Force pilot, 5-time NASA shuttle astronaut, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame for astronauts. He joined Sierra Space in 2013, which was Sierra Nevada at the time, to really was tasked in bringing the Dream Chaser to life, which they are going to talk about today. Last but not least is Adam Harris of Orbit Fab, Chief Commercial Officer. Orbit Fab is famously known for building gas stations in space. They are going to be fueling satellites in space in 2025 for a small price of $20 million for 100 kilograms of hydrazine. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Perfect. So thank you. It's so good to have all of you here. So much is happening in the space industry, but it feels like a lot of it has been really happening in the last 10 years. Why now? What are the reasons why there's been so much innovation in the last 10, 15 years?
The rate of innovation, the pace of technology has continued to advance. Our adversaries have not slowed down. They have made dramatic advancements in technology, hypersonic weapons, that kind of thing. So for me, I think we're just appreciating or reappreciating what space can do for life on Earth. And I do see that we are experiencing a momentum that's not unlike what there was in the 60s, right? When we first declared that we were going to make it to the moon. And so it's an exciting time. A lot of momentum behind space right now. I don't know if Steve or Adam has something to add.
Yeah, I think I agree with Monica. To her point about national security, space is now a contested environment. If you watch what's been happening, Starlink constellation's up and it's being used in Ukraine right now by the Ukrainian forces, and so it is a contested environment. It's booming, but from a commercial standpoint, what's really happening is we've been working in space for a lot of years and doing a lot of stuff, and what you've seen happening in the last 10 years, certainly I've been at Sierra Nevada and then Sierra Space for the last 11. In the time I've been there, the price of launch vehicles have dropped by well over 50%. And when you see that happening, what that does is that opens up access for a lot more people and a lot more businesses in space that we've never had before. And so I think that is contributing, the technology advances are all contributing to why space is suddenly booming, suddenly becoming commercial, and suddenly becoming open for a lot more people than you've ever seen before.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything that was just said, but I would also add, there's just a intersection of many different things going on in our world right now. Number one, the boom of information technology and IT and the internet has caused people to rethink, how do I get broadband? I can't drive down I-25, which I know every day, without my GPS telling me exactly which exit I need to get off of. And so our daily lives are affected by how space programs affect us. So that, first, I think the IT revolution has really changed the need side of the space programs. Second, launch vehicle prices have been coming down in recent decades. Great to watch SpaceX and watching them both launch rockets from the United States and landing those rockets. It's very exciting to see. It feels like that Apollo era when everybody got on their television set and watched those launches. And these days, that's happening again, and the excitement is there in space. And so a lot of things intersecting that are driving the commercial space economy. I think there's probably the next 5 to 10 years are going to be companies that we don't even have names for yet. They're going to be new innovations and ideas that come from the entrepreneurial side that don't exist. And for most, since 1960s, when the space program started, most of the programs came through NASA or Department of Defense, and now we're seeing this commercial evolution, really, of the programs. And so it's a very exciting time to be in this industry.
And Steve, you mentioned rocket prices or the cost of launching rockets coming down. And it seems like it's a key thing for the space economy to be built is for prices to get less expensive. We'll talk about that in satellites as well. What are you seeing? I mean, obviously Sierra Space is trying to solve for this with the Dream Chaser, where you're going to be able to reuse it up to 15 times. How big of an impact will that have in the economy and making it more sustainable?
Well, let's see. So what's happening? Well, I'll kind of describe for you why. You mentioned we did a capital raise, $1.4 billion capital raise. We did that intentionally because we saw this inflection point coming, and we thought the time was right to dramatically expand what we were doing as a company. We started Dream Chaser, which, for those of you not familiar with Dream Chaser, it's a lifting body spacecraft. It's like a mini space shuttle. We're in final production, by the way, right now, going to fly next year. We have a minimum 7 missions already contracted with NASA to go to the International Space Station. But we've been developing that and heavily investing, but when we designed it, even back 11 years ago, when we first started designing it, we knew that someday the low Earth orbit, in particular in space, would go commercial. And so we designed it to be commercial in nature. We designed it with reusability to get the cost down. We designed it intentionally to land on any runway you could land a 737 aircraft, because we wanted to take advantage of that infrastructure that already existed all over the world and use that for our spacecraft. With the launch vehicle pricing that's coming down, as we talked about earlier, then and the fact that NASA is getting ready to retire the International Space Station and is specifically wanting commercial companies to take over with a commercial space station, we saw an opportunity to create that next commercial space station. And with a space station and a specific technology, inflatable technology that we've been working on in my advanced programs group for exploration since about 2018, we saw it form the core of a space station that we could get up. As an example, it took NASA and Russia and Europe and Japan 40 launches and almost $150 billion to build the space station. We can build a space station with a third of the pressurized volume in 2 launches. And so with that technology, with the price of rockets coming down, with having a transportation system that's for both crew and cargo through Dream Chaser and a space station, we found ourselves in a position where we could create a low Earth orbit economy, and if we can get up there first, we can turn this into an international business platform. Think business park in space, and with the transportation and logistics, refueling services that they're offering, we can create this low Earth orbit economy, move industry off the planet, things like biopharma, advanced manufacturing, building satellites on orbit instead of on Earth, things like that. And so that's why we did the raise we did, to accelerate those products and take advantage and create this economy as soon as possible. It was a long answer.
It was perfect. Monica?
Yeah, so I'll add to Steve. Traditionally, space was the purview of governments, right? They were the only ones who could afford it. They were the ones who funded large programs, and they would work them oftentimes, most often, with large legacy contractors. And I do agree with Steve that kicking down the door in launch, which we have to give credit where credit is due, SpaceX, right, came in and said, I can do things differently, and it worked on the regulatory side as well. So toward making matters more affordable and more sustainable, the government created the Space Development Agency in 2019, and it is promoting a new dynamic in contracting in space. I was reading an article, I look at this group of CEOs and founders, I was reading a leadership article over the weekend, and it talked about the importance when you're a CEO or a senior executive of letting go of perfection and focusing on excellence. And it talked about how it can be less expensive, the incremental additional cost for perfection, the time lost are simply not worth it, and people can become paralyzed. So traditionally, the cycle to field a program in space, easily 10 years, a decade for sure, between the idea forming, putting the RFP out, the non-recurring engineering that's necessary, building it, testing it repeatedly, because there is no such thing as failure, right? Perfection is demanded. Finally launched maybe at 10 years. The Space Development Agency, in part to bring costs down, but also so we can field things faster, says, look, we're striving for excellence, not perfection. We want the minimal viable product, fast. And in addition, we are going to capitalize on commercial industry and what they have funded and what they have spent their money on. So building much more of a partnership. So I would agree with Steve that it is the commercial industry that's burgeoning and we're growing. But in addition, it's the government in many cases saying, I'm going to do this differently, and I want a supply chain of commercial companies, and I'm going to capitalize on those and use them. So I think it's a combination. We're seeing industry rise, and we're also seeing government do things differently and cede some of those massive, large, cost-plus legacy contracts that have been the traditional way of promoting a space economy.
I was going to ask Monica real quick, if you don't mind passing the mic back. When you won the recent contract with the Defense Department, you're considerably less expensive than your competitors because you're designing and manufacturing in-house. Was that the strategy all along? And are you going to start seeing that of more competitors where they bring manufacturing in-house?
Well, I hope so, and the answer is yes. And so while you ordinarily don't wish for competitors, in this environment, I believe that the more space companies that are built and thrive in this environment, the better for all of us. We all rise. So what was your second part of the question? You said, was this the plan all along? Absolutely. It's, we have buses, so the vision is to have, I don't know if everyone's familiar with space, you can raise your hand, but for a satellite, you can think of it as having two main components. One is the bus, which sort of is what it sounds like. It's what the payload rides on, but also it controls articulation and other important aspects of the lifetime of the satellite. And then the payload is what we think of as the operational part. So it might be communications with the ground, it might be optics on the ground, it might be weather control, that kind of thing. So if we can have buses on the shelf, a modular approach as we do, you can easily integrate payloads much faster and more economically and field them sooner. So that's our business model.
And so as satellites get a lot less or they become more inexpensive, what will that do to the industry as a whole?
Well, one of the things we'd like to do is help build a sustainable supply chain. So that's another thing. When the governments have largely funded these massive programs, what will happen is there'll be a supply base that lasts for as long as that program, and then then it's gone, right? Where do they go? And people are laid off and that sort of thing. So if we can sustainably keep building buses, have them on the shelves, have them ready to go, we can help promote the existence of a supply chain separate and apart from some of those large legacy programs that, let's face it, they only get funded, sometimes every 5 or 10 years, depending upon the need.
And Adam, I'm ready for you now.
Yeah, sure.
OrbitFab is obviously tackling this problem of sustainability with, instead of coming back down to Earth to refuel, you'll be able to refuel with your gas stations that you're building in space, whether that's actual gas or whether that's for water, all those supplies that you're planning on doing in space. What impact do you see that having on the space ecosystem as those gas stations are built?
Yeah, so one of the problems of the space industry that we saw was that typically you would put a spacecraft or a satellite in orbit and it would have one use. It would be thrown away after it. So, you know, it's not quite the right analogy, but imagine you took your car a couple hours away and you just had to throw it away. That would be quite an expensive trip. We do that in the world of space. We put satellites up. We think about putting enough fuel on a satellite for sometimes 10, 15 years. And so in every ounce, every kilogram that gets launched is a cost, is quite expensive in the launch industry. And so the problem that OrbitFab is addressing is how do you refuel and then reuse those spacecraft? As we think about how do you create kind of this bustling economy in space, how do you create the environment for humans to permanently live in orbit or on the moon or Mars or where they're going? Or how do we create spacecraft that continue in orbit, much like ISS does currently today? We go up to ISS and we refurbish it and we bring new capabilities, and some amazing missions around the Hubble Space Telescope where we brought up new capabilities into orbit. And so we looked at that problem and said, what's the commercially viable next step? And we think refueling of those spacecraft is the right answer. And so on one level, refueling can be thought of as a life extension. It can be thought of, take the satellite, the asset that you've got, and we have a refueling interface that you can put on your spacecraft and fill that spacecraft. And then that spacecraft you can add fuel and you can extend the life of that spacecraft. On another level, you could launch, and this is extreme, but the extreme level is you launch your spacecraft without any fuel at all, and then we come and refuel you. Mainly that's coming about because the market is changing and you can launch fuel, which is not that sensitive, in a less expensive way than you launch highly sensitive spacecraft components or people, for instance, on these launch vehicles. And so the economy of the launch vehicle question really has allowed companies like OrbitFab to exist in this market and to offer fuel for those spacecraft. And so it can be everything from life extension to really changing how you do business in space.
And Adam, I have to ask, you're a former employee at SpaceX.
I am.
What was that experience like? And what are the lessons learned you're taking now into OrbitFab?
Yeah, so I guess there's lots of stories about being an employee at SpaceX, and I would say most of them are true. But it is, what's unique about SpaceX is that people who go work there are all in on the vision. You know, Elon talks about this, and it's interesting. I don't think people who hear him say this believe whether it's true or not that he really believes it. And I will say he definitely believes that we need to launch 1,000 people to the surface of Mars within his lifetime. That is his goal, singularly focused on that goal. And when you're at SpaceX, you come for that vision. And so probably the lesson about SpaceX is vision drives people to do extraordinary things. And so the long hours and the low pay and those things that are typically in the press about SpaceX employees, each one of those folks chose to join because they wanted to fulfill that vision. They wanted to be part of that mission. And it's true at SpaceX when we would get together in groups and talk about, you know, do you want this for your life? Is this a lifestyle that you want to be part of and doing things that are going to change humanity? And folks who said, no, I want something different, or I want a different lifestyle. I'm not going to be here on Saturdays and Sundays. That was all okay, and there's a lot of now startups in the space arena that are seeded by different SpaceX folks, and all that was okay with Elon and the leadership at SpaceX. And so I would say, but when you're there, you're sort of all into the mission.
Yeah. Sort of the PayPal effect, seeding all new companies.
Absolutely.
For employees.
Yeah.
Talking about vision, Steve, you've been to space 5 times. And now you're building the Dream Chaser. You've been building it since 2013, and you're talking about the commercialization of that vehicle. Did you ever imagine when you're going to space the first time that we'd be talking about these kind of things, that these realities would be coming true?
No, not at all. I mean, when I was at NASA, none of this commercial stuff was really going. It was very much, like Monica mentioned, it's all government contracts. It was all government. It was a government game, and it started. It really started really after the Columbia mishap, and we decided to retire the space shuttle, get space station built. NASA made an initial bet on commercial cargo, and in commercial crew, they put a little bit of money into it, said, well, we need a more affordable way to get to space, and they took a big risk, if you will, and said, can we seed it? Can we make this happen? Can we turn the contracting process into what are called public-private partnerships, where a company invests, but in the end that they own the vehicle, and NASA buys services instead of owning the vehicle and running the vehicle, much like the shuttle program and the space station program is. And you saw that manifested. Actually, that's what our vehicle is. That's what Dream Chaser is. We're a public-private partnership, but we own the vehicle, we own the IP, we own the design, we operate it, and NASA buys services. So they're not really buying, they're buying essentially transportation services from us. But it was a completely foreign concept at the time. SpaceX was just starting. They were blowing up rockets, and everybody's kind of waiting to see what happened. You had the traditional launch providers that were very reliable and also very expensive. And so I never thought it, but toward the end of my career at NASA, I saw it starting to happen, and when this opportunity presented itself, that's why I decided to go do it, because I thought, given the budgets and what was going on and the cost of exploration, which is really what NASA's focused on, I figured, this has a chance of working, and I thought maybe I can go there and make a difference. So that's why I pulled the trigger and went to SNC back then.
And you're working on a few different projects at Sierra Space. Can you talk about some of the other projects that you're working on along with the Dream Chaser?
Well, I'm basically working all the national security stuff that our company does, but I can't talk about that, obviously. Advanced Programs Group, I can tell you generically what we're doing is have a very small team. We're the one team within the whole company that has permission to fail. And that's important because what we're trying to do is we're looking out 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years in the future and trying to imagine what space is going to be like then, and then develop the technologies and test those technologies quickly, fail fast, so that we're in a position to essentially accelerate those products when the time comes and when the market is ready for them. And so, as an example, if you consider the vision a lot of folks have now, and we do too, is that if 10 years from now we have, instead of a handful of people living and working in space, let's say we have 1,000 people working in space, you got to ask yourself the question, is a Dream Chaser that can carry 6 or 7 crew members the right vehicle for that future? And it probably isn't. So what does that next vehicle look like? What do launch vehicles look like in the future? What do destinations look like in the future, depending on what industries come out of what we're developing right now? And so my Advanced Programs Group, that's what we focus on is innovation, creativity, and we're working a lot of stuff you would find strange, but I can't comment on it.
And Monica, we talked about this is an industry that requires a ton of capital, Sierra Space being a good example of that. And one of the solutions seemed at one point was SPACs, right? Companies could go to the public market, maybe quote unquote easier and earlier, in a long-term horizon for investors. And unfortunately, the market hasn't done as well, and it hasn't done as well across the board. Is there a future for SPACs in space, and how will space companies do on the public markets with such a long-term horizon?
Yeah, such a great question. So show of hands, are people in the audience familiar with SPACs? All right, it looks like a lot of people are. All right, so it's a means of going public that is an alternative to more of a traditional IPO. And there was a SPAC frenzy almost, not only in space, but yes, because we have literally thousands of new commercial space companies over the last couple of years. I think they're getting a lot of attention. And so some CEOs would say, I like this idea of going public via SPAC because I will be working with some investors who seem to understand my industry. If I have a tough model for the ordinary investor to get their head around, aren't I better off taking an investor who understands it and who can value it in a manner that we both agree upon? And what happened was the SPAC frenzy at times came at the expense of an appropriate amount of diligence into the real revenue generating capability of that company. And so what we saw is that all SPACs are not created equal. So some of them, yeah, they probably were overvalued and the market really caused them to settle back in. I think it caused some companies that had they gone public via a more traditional option might actually have stayed at a higher level, but we started to get almost a skepticism regarding SPACs, and so they had to start to shake that off. I do see it leveling off. But I do not think that we will see the return of the number of SPACs that we did in the past. We won't see 2021 return. But I also don't see commercial companies having trouble with liquidity. So if you look at venture money, for example, it set a record in 2021, 50% higher than in 2020. The number of investment, the value of venture money invested in space companies, and I do believe we'll continue to see that.
And outside of liquidity and investment, there's so many hard challenges in space, right? There's so many hard problems to go after. What do you think are some of the really hard problems that entrepreneurs are going to have to solve for in space over the next 10 years?
So space is hard, as we say, that's kind of the joke, and that's true. But I will tell you that what we are seeing and hearing is, can you scale up fast enough? Can you do it? Can you hire in this environment, and can you scale up at the pace you need to scale? And I'll say, yes, we absolutely can. People are very excited to be a part of new space, and we are seeing people very interested in joining. Now, I will tell you, there can be a difference. I'm looking at my colleagues on the stage here, between someone who wants to be at a cozy, sort of more legacy company that has more certainty and potentially less upside in the end. Those companies are the ones that have the real challenge in the new space economy, not the upstarts, not the people in this audience, because it is much, much more difficult to scale back. What we're seeing is the government and others are demanding lower prices. They're demanding firm fixed price contracts that we will stand behind. And that means you can't over-engineer. That means you can't over-test. It means you have to pay attention to the customer when they say we want excellence, not perfection. And there are people who, in many cases, have worked at these companies 20, 30, and 40 years, and they're invested in doing things the same way. So I will say, yes, absolutely. Startups, entrepreneurs, small, new companies have their challenges, but I will take those challenges 8 days a week over a large legacy company that really has to change a philosophy, potentially under thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees. I don't know if Steve or Adam have thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure where to go with the question, though, because when challenges with space in the future, I think you're absolutely right. Scaling down is really hard. Staying agile and as a company like us, continually disrupting orbits is really important. Because if we don't do that, somebody else will. Figuring out the low Earth orbit economy and what is it going to look like in the future. There are a lot of technical challenges. I can tell you one of the biggest challenges we're trying to figure out, and I think everybody else is right now, is we intend to fly a lot of these vehicles, but right now there's not enough launch capacity. We could use all the launch capacity there is, and it's still not enough for us. And so what does that look like in the future? What that indicates to me is you need more launch sites, you need more rockets, things like that. When you're particularly in low Earth orbit, where all of us are in, orbital debris is getting to be a really serious problem. And we have to figure out, whether that be from a regulatory standpoint and also a technical standpoint, how to deal with that problem. And so to me, that's one of the biggest challenges going forward, is the orbital debris problem, particularly in low Earth orbit.
Yeah, I feel like you set me up there on debris. I think that's a fantastic segue. So One of the best reasons to refuel a spacecraft is if you have a spacecraft that's going to grab a piece of orbital debris, send it back into either burn up in the atmosphere or send it away into we call it graveyard orbits, away from other spacecraft. But we have lots of debris in orbit these days, and we need to solve that problem. One of the hardest regulatory problems of space debris is when the biggest chunks of space debris are old rocket bodies, and a lot of these are Russian rocket bodies or Chinese rocket bodies. And so if a US company says, well, my business is based on going to grab a Russian rocket body and deorbiting it, we've already heard from Russia, they say, no, don't touch that, that's mine. Even if it's been in orbit, it's going to be in orbit for 200 years. And so there's not a consensus across the international community about how you deal with grabbing some other country's debris and dealing with that problem. You can grab your own debris, or you can grab your own spacecraft and maneuver it. But if it is somebody else's, there's this idea about ownership in space that's a little bit different. It doesn't quite work like the ocean, where if it's a derelict ship that anybody can grab it and then make use of it. It doesn't quite happen that way in space. Countries each license their launches and license their activities in space, and so they feel a bit of ownership of that in the future. And so I would say one of the challenges that we see is, one of the great things about the United States is this entrepreneurial community that is pushing innovation, but from a geopolitical space standpoint, we're seeing China go to the moon, where they're putting up space stations. They're competing at a very national level, and they put out 10 and 15-year targets, and they're hitting every one of their targets. And then the US space program is debating the budgets for whether there will really be budgets or not. And so from a government standpoint, really the entrepreneurial space community is keeping the United States ahead at the moment in technology innovation.
So if I just may add to Adam's remarks, that's why the Space Development Agency, I believe, is so important and needs an opportunity to prove out its business model. Only founded in 2019, it will launch satellites in 2022. That is an absolutely unheard of, unimaginable pace, and it requires a change in philosophy of government contracting, as we discussed before. And so I think that as we continue to push the envelope in these important ways, government agencies and companies need to be supporting this faster timeline. I think your point is very well taken. The joke sometimes is that bureaucracy is a necessary complement to democracy, and there is a certain degree of that is required, but our adversaries don't have that, right? They're not democracies, so they're working at a different pace.
So outside of the obvious challenges in space, with innovation and change comes criticism. Some people think, why are we spending billions of dollars in space when we have our own problems to fix on Earth? What are your thoughts on that when people raise those kind of questions?
Why'd you hand the mic to me?
Well, he said criticism, so I figured, yeah.
Oh boy, yeah, and I've gotten this question thousands of times. I mean, if you look at what space has produced, I think it was referenced at the beginning of this talk that every one of us rely on GPS on our phones, on satellite technology for communications, and everything like that. All of the things that we're doing lead to those things. I'll give you an example from my own career. GPS, when I was a long time ago, I was a test pilot, and I was flying a brand new aircraft, that one of the very first aircraft that ever had a GPS receiver installed in it, and it updated our inertial navigation system. And when I was flying this airplane, we only had enough GPS satellites for about 4 hours of coverage a day. And I just happened to be flying it one day when I had GPS coverage. And what it did to my navigation system on that airplane, it was just incredible. It was so accurate. It would I could taxi my parking spot using it. And I thought, wow, this GPS thing, it's going to change everything. But I was thinking in terms of military aviation. But if you think about what GPS does for you today, It has so many uses that I never imagined, even though I was on the leading edge of it back then. And I think a lot of the other technologies that are being developed right now in space really improve life on Earth. Our whole business plan is based on improving life on Earth. It's not really, but we're using space as a medium to do that, but that's not what we're about. We're about, example in space. You can grow tissues in 3D in space in a microgravity environment. A lot harder to do here on Earth. This technology on the space station started called bioreactor to do that. But imagine in the future, if you could grow organs in space, because you can do this 3D tissue growth, if you can grow organs for transplant in space and then transport them back to whoever needs them, imagine what that would do to those long lists of people waiting for organ transplants and things like that. So things like that, I truly believe we will see in the future, and it's going to revolutionize life on Earth. So that's why we invest in space.
Anybody?
Sure.
Yeah, I would say two answers to that. One is giving young kids something to be inspired by. I think space is an excellent example of that. I also think space enables us to solve problems here on Earth. For instance, I think, when we look at climate change and we look at poverty or we look at hunger, one of the first things that brings people up to a level that we have here in Denver and the area here is education and understanding how to grow, how to have clean water, all of these things. And the internet is not just in space, but we can bring those kind of education things to folks who don't have ready education sources. There's plenty of countries around the world which the governments control what the population sees or understands, and broadcasting in with space programs and with programs that really bring people out of poverty levels is enabled by space. And I think that just communications, GPS, all of those things allow people to live better lives, and that will have a huge impact on how we are here on Earth.
Yeah. A quick comment about the clean water thing, because another quick example, the space station, I don't know if you know, but on the space station we recycle everything, urine, wastewater, we even pull the humidity out of the air and recycle that into drinking water. And that technology has been developed to try to close the loops, because again, it costs money to lift water, so you want to recycle it, close the loop as much as possible. But that technology is being now used all over the world to provide clean drinking water to people in areas that have never had access to it before. So it's an example of a really simple spin-off of some technology that we invested a lot of money in to get it, and it's having benefits everywhere.
Yeah, to add to that, and all joking aside, York has a really easy answer to this question. So I know we think of space and outer space as looking up and away, but in fact, we look up and away so that we can now look down and in and improve terrestrial life. So among other things, these types of satellites that we're building and fielding permit warfighters in the field to hear each other and communicate with each other in a far superior manner. And we're seeing that commercial companies are appreciating, look, for example, I might make machinery or equipment or sell a product that's used in a remote area and I can't reach those people. They don't have internet. Well, think about it. You're not gonna lay wire through the desert, right? Far, far easier is doing it via satellite. And if you think about it too, while you were talking, it occurred to me that it used to be the province, right, of governments, space. But if you think back in the day, ocean and exploration was the stuff of kings and queens. They were the only ones who could afford it. The people who were doing it were called crazy. They were saying, why don't we spend this money here at home? But now could you imagine not being able to ship goods across the ocean? How much better did it make life on land? And I think that's how we will see the space economy play out as well. Sure, we'll be exploring space, but you know what? We'll be making life a lot better here on Earth.
That's a really good point. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I want to hear your vision of what space is going to look like. Not in the next 10 years, but 100, 200 years. What are your thoughts on what space will look like?
The audience would like to answer. Oh, dark and cold. You know, it's funny, at one company for sort of an April Fool's event, they said that we were going to create the scent of space, and they went to astronauts. I'd be interested in what Steve thinks of this. And they said, what does space smell like? And they said, they said metal and disinfectant.
Smells like burned metal. And you know that because when crew members come in from spacewalks, they've been out and their suits have been exposed to the vacuum, and they come back in, and it's really the ionization of atomic oxygen and things like that in space. And so when they come back in, it smells like burned metal, is what it smells like, for whatever that's worth. What does the world, what does space look like in 200 years or something like that? I think we'll have societies off planet, whether they be off planet in orbit or whether in Mars or at Mars or other places. I think you'll see, honestly, a lot of in situ resource utilization, mining of asteroids and other places. Moon, I'm not sure how economical that's going to be, but we'll wait and see. Certainly Mars and other places will be economical, and certainly asteroids are. So I think you'll see a lot of mining. I think you'll see manufacturing moving off planet. And I think if I were to walk in a classroom 200 years from today and say, hi, I'm Steve, I'm an astronaut, everybody go, well, big deal, everybody does that. and actually that's what I'm working for. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, my first answer to that question is I'm trying to figure out what to do with my portfolio in the next 3 months. And so 100 years is, you can take that in a lot of different ways. But I think in that 100 to 200 year time frame, I do see people living off planet, people deciding to live either in space stations or on the moon and Mars as a destination and a place that they're going to live out their lives. And I think that's a pretty exciting future. I think that leads us to using space resources. I think mining of asteroids and things like that. There are many metals in space. There are many resources that are in space, vastly more than what's here on Earth. And so around the Earth, I think a lot of activities on Earth will be enabled by space. Just the advances on self-driving cars, self-flying airplanes, all of those things are going to be enabled by the GPS signal that tells them exactly where they are. And it's not just going to be waypoint to waypoint, but it's going to be within millimeters of accuracy. And so we're seeing a lot of those innovations happen that are, I think, life on Earth gets better because of the innovations that we're going to see in the space economy.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting future.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it a little bit because I agree with Adam and Steve completely. I'm going to return to, well, what will the Denver, Colorado Springs corridor, space corridor, look like in 100 to 200 years? So right now, it's already the largest space economy outside of Cape Canaveral, and I'm going to predict that it will continue to grow and flourish because we're seeing that space companies, even that are founded elsewhere, are opening offices in this area because we are recognized as the pulse of this commercial space industry. So my prediction is we will see it only grow.
That's really great to hear. We've got a few minutes for questions, so if anyone has any questions, looks like we've got one in the far back. I don't know if there's another mic.
This is a commercial question that goes quite a ways back in history. I always glad to hear people talk about the recovery system on space station and all that because I've got like 7 flight hardware technologies up there. It started with me in a chemistry book in my labs. And we made extra special effort to spin those off to commercial applications and industrial and consumer products. What we're concerned with right now is there's so much mass about a space economy that we're kind of losing sight of those benefits to humanity, which are the only real reason to have a space program. So my question is really a structural corporate question because I work in investments and things like that now, although we're doing a new space company, as you might imagine, like everybody else. What are you doing specifically to work on those quote-unquote NASA spin-offs and really get after big consumer and industrial markets that you're going to need to really fund a sustainable business model for these space stations in low Earth orbit in particular, because the people you need to do spacecraft flight hardware are very different people that can be competitive industrially and with consumer products?
That's a really good question, and since we're building a commercial space station, we are hyper-focused on exactly what you just said. We're actually hiring people from industry, non-space industry. We're going out and talking to non-space industry about how to create a business out of what we're doing, or how we can enhance your business or help you create the next product in the future. And so it's part of building the space, and I would argue that developing, if I have your question right, developing that economy to go with what we're trying to do is every bit as important, if not more important, than doing the technical development of the space station and the transportation, the destinations. And so we are very intentional about that from a marketing standpoint, from a business development standpoint, and from a technical standpoint to say, okay, if you want to put an FDA-approved lab on orbit and create these products for whatever, for cancer drugs or you name it, what does an FDA-approved lab look like on our space station? And how do we design it? How do we build it? And what kind of services do you need? What kind of turnaround do you need? What kind of data do you need? How often do you need to refly? Do you need people on orbit to operate, or can be automated? What does that look like in trying to specifically create what you're talking about to create that economy?
Yeah, I was going to answer that what the space economy needs is more venture capital thought process, mainly because there's a lot of engineering and there's a lot of technology in this industry. There's a lot of great ideas, but what we need is productization, sort of making those products that are great advancements in the technology, the things that are spin-offs from the space station and NASA programs. How do you turn that into a commercial product? And I think the venture community does that. It's a cutthroat place. It's a place where only the good ideas survive. And I think that's really what the space economy needs right now, is that level of scrutiny and that level of making a return on investment will make this entire economy better in the future.
Hi, you touched on my question, but I'm curious to know more. It's predicted that there will be at least 150,000 trackable objects, assets in space, LEO in specific, within the next few years. Can you talk about the importance of getting collision avoidance right in terms of national security, commercial sustainability, not just getting the accuracy of the predictions better, but also in terms of opening channels of communication and just the ethics of deciding who commits to that maneuver?
Yeah, so every day in space, we do these notices of collision avoidance. The space objects, some of them might be as small as paint chips, but they're moving so fast to stay in orbit that if they collide with another object, it's really going to create a lot more space debris. And so we have these collision avoidance notices, but they're I would say fair to okay in the prediction of whether an object is going to hit another object in space. And so on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, different spacecraft operators need to decide, do I make a maneuver? Do I move out of the way? Do I use fuel? And sometimes that means use fuel to move a little bit out of the way, but then I lose a year of life on that spacecraft because I've used up the fuel that was going to sustain me for longer. And so there's a lot of ways that we need to tackle this space debris problem. A lot of folks talking about the regulatory side, but also really just the good actor in space, the operators that really care about a future economy that happens in space. And that's probably where we're going to see the most benefit. We just need to convince companies that that's the right thing to do.
So,
Looks like-
whoa,
no, go
I
ahead.
just got really loud. Did you have something else to add?
Perhaps because of my background, I'm going to add something that's easier said than done, but we do need international laws, international norms of behavior that nation states sign up to, because this is a perfect example of where if you have only a subset of the international community complying, it won't be enough.
I think we've got time for one last question.
So, hey, Matt. So on the back of your VC point in TAM, I guess, topic, it's really complicated for investors to think of a 20 to 30 year holdup. And also hard to think about a TAM in general when these markets are still coming up. And these products seem to solve for a small part of the value chain, i.e., this particular subject, there's software that shows you where these objects are floating, but then you have to hire another company or contract with another company to go in and actually get it. So how do you think about products that are solving for a small slice in overall TAM and how investors can start to wrap their head around this entire value chain?
You're talking specifically about debris removal, right? Was that your question?
That was just an example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll talk to you about debris, because talk about the regulatory. Obviously, we do need international laws. We need, national regs. If you're going to put a satellite up or something up in orbit, you're responsible for all that stuff. Make sure it's put in the proper orbit, and make sure you dispose of it properly when you're done with it, and don't leave it sitting up there. So the question is, on debris removal, how do you do that, and how do you do that? The problem I see with debris removal is the physics of low Earth orbit. You're in a specific orbit. It's really hard to get in a specific orbit, and once you're in a specific orbit or inclination, it's very, very difficult to move to a new one while you're up there, because the energy required is so great because of the physics. And so, to me, the challenge of debris removal is, in dealing with that, and to your point, the value chain is, number one, who's going to pay for it? And I would argue that the company that puts it up there is the one that needs to be paying for it. And number two, you need to come up with a solution that's cheaper than what it cost you to put the thing up there in the first place. And to my knowledge, we haven't solved that yet.
And I think, Elise, part of your question too was, how do investors evaluate these companies, right, when it's a 20 to 30 horizon? Is that right? What are your thoughts on that, Steve or Adam or Monica?
Oh, how do you evaluate 20? Well, that's the challenge with value chain and investors. To me, the challenge with the space horizon, since we just went through this capital raise, is we actually seek out investors that have more of a long-term view. You have to have a long-term view because it takes a long time to develop this stuff and get it up there. And so you have to show the return, you have to show the markets, you have to show the capital in the future. But it's a challenge for most investors to look out 20 or 30 years in the future and say, I'm going to invest now and I'm going to make my money back in 20 years. That's really hard.
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit I don't know the answer to this question, but I would say, how do you think about investing in Columbus's journey to the New World, right? I mean, that's something that everybody around you is saying is a terrible idea. Like, you're going to go throw ships and they're going to fall off the edge, and all those things that were happening at that time. And so we have a similar problem in space, is there's a huge economy that's available there, and finding the right investment or the right niche that will grow products and grow revenue of the future is one I wish I could predict, because I would invest all my money there. I don't know.
All right, I think we're at time now, but please give a big hand to our panelists.